Hi, I'm Shan Wu with a Under Color of Law analysis of the problems with our election polling. Now, let me start by saying I want to push back against a stereotype of Asians. I'm not a quant guy. I'm not particularly good at statistics. Math was a great challenge for me. That's why I didn't go to med school. But I do certainly understand the crazy amount of dissonance we're getting from all the different polling and people being really fed up with it. So I actually found a really great explanation of it that I've already tweeted about from a Washington Post column, and we'll put up that link for you. And that led me to look at some other issues about polling. And so here's what I wanted to really share with you. That Post piece starts out with this great question, which is somebody asks, quote, "How accurate is political polling, given that in today's world, landlines are the exception rather than a rule? The younger generation does not answer their cell phones, and it seems like the only people that do answer voice calls are old fogies like myself," unquote. That question actually goes to the heart of the discoveries that I've made about polling, in which some of you may already know, and maybe some of you don't know all of the things that I'm going to discuss with you. So the first point is that I have always assumed that a lot of the polling comes from phone calls, and I wonder, like many of you, I've never been called. And it turns out I also thought they'd regularly access cell phone records, but I'm realizing that they have a much harder time dialing cell phones than they do landlines, and that the original way it was done was just through landlines. Turns out that, as that person asks, it is true that it's really hard to get people on landlines now. And that since people don't answer that, the pollsters have had to go to a different way of getting people to respond. And what was fascinating to me was that it turns out that some of the polls actually take out ads to get people to answer the ads. They get paid for it. I've never answered an ad. I've never actually seen one before. And those are considered to be maybe not the gold standard for it. And what the gold standard folks do is they go all out trying to find people. Not only do they use phone calls, they actually go and knock on the door. They're mailing people, using any technique they can to try to get people who will actually respond to the poll question. Then, well, it turns out that the easiest people to reach are white retired men, apparently, statistically speaking. And then what happens, this was quite shocking to me actually, is that they assign weight to the different categories of people. This, I think, really explains where you hear pollsters start talking about how it's a little bit more art than science. And I actually recently attended a portion of a lecture by a professor at my daughter's college, university, who had been involved in some of the last presidential elections, projections, and polling issues. And I listened to him for a while, and the impression I got was a really smart guy, knows a lot about statistics, very upfront about the fact that there are many different models being used. But at the end of it, I didn't quite really get like, okay, so why is it more art than science? I guess it's just that they're using different models. Well, here's what's really important about the different models. It's this weighting issue. So as this column in the Post points out, it's easier to reach women than men, and it's easier to reach white people than minorities, Black, Asians, or Hispanic Americans. So therefore, that makes the people that are harder to reach more valuable for the pollsters. Particularly hard to reach are young folks, definitely not answering the landlines, probably too busy. And of course, we know that the young people population are the ones who are always tending to undervote. So that's a particularly valuable population. Well, what the pollsters do is they weight that golden group, the young folks, much more than other people. So if you get a young person answering the poll as compared to a older retiree, white male, the young person is weighted much more heavily. Similarly, as we've heard, all this talk about is Trump beginning to gain more or peeling off Latinos, peeling off black voters, etc. Those same people are weighted much more heavily. They're much more valuable to the pollsters because of the fact that it's harder to get to them. Now, on top of that, you add in some other issues as well, which is the education of people, their background. And then what happened was in 2016 and 2020, when the polls famously underestimated support for Trump, then what happened was they began to come up with a sort of more difficult measurement, which they actually now are trying to weight in even more than Asian education, the partisanship, meaning have you previously voted Democratic or Republican? Now, just common sense for a second, how do you figure that out? Are they registered Republicans, Democrats? What are they telling you with that? That creates a very wide variety of weighting standards and a wide variety of models at that point. And so what was really striking to me about that was, as the article put it, what happens now is that instead of being able to reach a good sampling of the American population that cuts across demographics, instead you have to basically try to create that demographic through weighting the people that you do find. Really hard to find people. And so to me, you disproportionately give weight to what their demographic is in an effort to sort of recreate what you might have been able to do decades ago by actually polling a lot of people. Now, for a lot of the folks who have been around this industry for a long time, it has been an enormous shifting of the ground. I mean, they will tell you that back in the beginning of polling, maybe back in the 50s or 60s, you would not be trying to introduce something like the partisanship for the weight issue. So that really taught me that it's a very different world right now in terms of what we understand polling to be. And the problem for mainstream media has been, I think, an enormous reliance on this industry. It's not a cottage industry, it's a huge industry of polling. Nothing wrong with trying to use polls, although we really need to understand what their weaknesses are here and what kind of science they're actually applying to them. But what they're doing here is they're basically using those polls to encourage the idea of covering the presidential election like a horse race. Now, it's fine to cover a race like a race, but there can be a problem when you're not able to cover the underlying issues because you're too focused on making it look like a race. And the polling really helps that by constantly paying attention to, oh, this poll says Trump is up, this poll says Harris is up. It turns it much more into this is like an athletic event. That's an implicit bias of mainstream media. Like all of us, they want to do things that they're used to doing and staying in their comfort zone. And so one way in which this comfort zone has failed us as consumers of the news is what some people refer to as the sane-washing. But what that really is that in the urge to cover this race like any other race, the mainstream media tends to ignore the fascist and the authoritarian sexist message that comes up from Trump and MAGAs, because it seems to them that if you put that out there, it may look like they, the media, are biased. And they want to make it seem more like, oh, that's just a political difference of view. These are policy issues. They aren't policy issues. Being sexist or misogynist or racist is not a policy issue. I mean, it's just a hatred thing. And the danger here is of saying when that's called out, then that's being criticized as being too divisive. Just look at what happened when President Biden used the word garbage, whether he used it with an apostrophe or not. That became a huge issue, just as when Hillary Clinton used the term deplorables. But in the meantime, Trump and MAGAs can use all sorts of horrible words, saying bad things about women, calling them names, calling people animals. But if you attempt to push back on that, you may be labeled as too divisive. So I don't know what the answer is for the future of polling, but I do know what's really important is for all of us to understand exactly what goes into that mixture. Not to make us all statisticians, but to make us understand that this is the way that the sausage is made, so we aren't taken in excessively by the magic of the end product. We aren't taken in by our desire to have answers to things that are unknowable, and that we're able to force ourselves to move into the zones of discomfort, not just sticking with what seems normal, what's comforting and normal to us. Because at the end of this election, we are overdue to go into a very uncomfortable place. And that's to ask ourselves, how did this particular race become the race that it is? How did a candidate and a party that so obviously embraces fascism, authoritarianism, sexism, misogyny, racism, how did they become so popular? That's a very uncomfortable area to be in, but it's one that we need to look at next. So that's it for now. Please do subscribe to the channel. It's great having the chance to talk with you more often, and keep those replies and comments coming. I really get a lot out of it, and I really enjoy seeing them. Thanks.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories, the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.